So thank you very much for joining the Hybrid Remote Center of Excellence. I'm Nola Simon, I'm your host, and today joining me is Rose Fass. She is the CEO and founder of Fast Forward, and she's also the author of a new book called The Leadership Conversation, but she also has a previous book, which is called The Chocolate Conversation. And conversation is just perfect for this podcast, so I wanted to bring Rose on here. So thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
This is a test again of my conversational abilities because Rose and I have never actually interacted before. Usually I interact often with my guests on LinkedIn, but Rose founded the company with Gavin McMahon, and Gavin is the person that I know. I actually met Gavin for a coffee chat last year, but most of the time we just chat about his podcast or not his newsletter. And I think I was actually the first person to tell him that he had been featured by LinkedIn News. And to see that grow from that one instance into a newsletter that's constantly featured in LinkedIn has been really exciting for me to watch. So that's the background in terms of how I actually was introduced to Rose.
Yeah, I'll tell you just a bit about myself and how Gavin and I came together. Um, Years ago, I was I think it was in 1993. I was running the Northeast region for Xerox on the executive team. And I always managed a P&L. It was the story of my life. I had spent 23 years there. Prior to that, I had started on the Saks Fifth Avenue training program, was in cosmetics for a period of time as the national sales manager for Mary Quant, who was the inventor of the miniskirt. Never intended to be in tech, always was in fashion, and ended up meeting an officer of Xerox who they wanted to bring women into the workforce. I'll be 74 in April. And at the time, there were no women working, very few women were working in tech, and Xerox was early tech. So I got hired as one of two women, and that's how I got started. And I ended up later the chief transformation officer for Xerox, which actually became the foundation for what Fast Forward Consulting Group would. Anne Mulcahy was the chief of staff at the time. And she and I got chatting, and she said to me, I'd love for you to come over to corporate and help us with the transition for year 2000. And I said, me come to corporate? I'm not a staffer, Anne. I manage P&Ls and da da da. It's time for you to do a stint in staff. Very long story short, Nola, I ended up taking that job. And as life always has it, that actually became the foundation for the work that I did for the rest of my career here. I later left and went to Gartner with Bill McDermott. I retired from Xerox, went to Gartner with Bill McDermott, and that was when Xerox was just making a turn and not quite getting there. And Bill McDermott is now the CEO of ServiceNow, and he's written the foreword of the book. And I met Gavin there. And he was a classically trained engineer, but he fascinated me because he has interests in so many things. And you've read his newsletter, and you could say. So we started a conversation some 22 years ago that landed in my calling him. Gart had a downturn. They had took a convertible loan without a floor, the CEO at that time, and they came a knocking for their money. And he bet the market cap of the company. And unfortunately, a lot of things went south. So both Gavin and I found ourselves not working at Gartner anymore for all the wrong reasons. But I decided, let's start this. And I called him in London and he said, I'm a little risk adverse, Rose, but I've got a family I have to take care of. Can you do this? And I said, yeah, I can. And our first customer was Estee Lauder. And I write about my story about them in the chocolate conversation. And long story short, we started the firm 21 years ago. And there were two thoughts I had, Nola, which is similar to what we were talking about earlier with this yin and the yang. I said to myself, for a woman to be credible and taken seriously, it takes a tremendous amount of effort, even today, which is a sad commentary, but true. And I thought, if I have a British guy who wears glasses, who's 6 feet tall and looks great in a suit, it's going to add a whole level of credibility. And even though he is very smart, he had written the case study for Netscape in the London School of Business. He sounded so smart because he had that wonderful British accent. So when we showed up in a room, everybody took us seriously, and I bypassed all the nonsense. And he followed me around for a while doing this transformation kind of work. And he fell in love with the whole concept of leadership happens in the conversation. And I said to him, management is something you can plan for, like an engineer. You can manage work, you can manage a process, you can manage a lot of things, but you can't manage people. They, one, don't want to be managed, and two, they have thoughts and feelings and everything else of their own. And so leadership requires a whole different gene set. And he said to me, okay. And I said, and it happens in the conversation. And he said, what? I said, look at Rosa Parks. She just didn't give up her seat on the bus. Somebody walked over to her and she made a decision in that moment. Leadership always happens in the moment. It's always a choice. And it's the conversation you have with yourself first. Conversation with self. I sat in the back of the bus. I'm already got some white dudes standing next to me wanting my seat. This is really not terribly fair. I'm tired. And why? Because my skin is a different color. Do I have to give this guy my seat? That's going on in her head. And I've read all of the bios and everything else. In that moment, there were a number of people of color on that bus. They all put their heads down. They were afraid. They didn't want to get involved in that conversation. And for rightful reasons, because she wasn't putting a KPI at stake, key performance indicator. She was putting her life on the line, and she knew it. And the bus driver came down and he said, I'm going to call the police. So they did. And the police said, if you don't give up your seat, we're going to arrest you. And she very graciously said, you may do that. Just a simple leadership moment. She put it all on the line. And the rest, of course, is history. She did not know that her grandchildren would read about her in history books, or that Mandela would run off a plane and throw his arms around her, or that she would sit with senators at state dinners. She was just an ordinary woman making an ordinary practice an extraordinary moment. And so Gavin said, I get it. And we went out. And 21 years later, we are spending a lot of time with Fortune 100 companies explaining to them, and you're a storyteller, Nola, that life in corporate today can't just be process and technology changes and procedures. There has to be innovative narratives that bring people together, that tell the story of the company, that take that institutional memory and turn it into something real and living. And leadership has to happen in the conversations you're having, whether you're having them in PowerPoint, on a chat, through a text message, walking in the hallway, one on one, on Zoom. It doesn't matter. It's leadership happening in the conversation. And every leader is given the opportunity to have a moment. Most recently, Zelensky, one of the few global leaders that has had the courage to step up and step into his leadership. And I thought it was fascinating. It went around the world when people said, we need to get you out of harm's way. And he said, no, it's my country. Give me weapons to defend my country. I don't need a ride. Who would, that was Winston Churchill, and it was a moment. And so these moments are what I spend a lot of time talking about in this book and sharing conversations. Very incredible women. Mary Jackson from Nassau, not Catherine, Mary,
Is this the
who,
story of Hidden Figures?
yes,
Yes, that was what I
yes,
noticed in your book launch, and I actually was hoping that you would tell us that story.
yes. Mary, Hidden Figures, by the way, I'm old. So Hidden Figures is a very accurate representation of what took them, not as old as Mary and Catherine, but truly those women paved the way for all of us in ways that we will never understand. And Catherine got the most amount of accolades because, of course, she was the mathematician that put Neil Armstrong on in space, and I get that. But Mary was working for a Holocaust survivor engineer, Jewish man, and he was the one that said to her, if you want to promote your career, you got to get your classes in and you've got to go to become an engineer. You've got to get these classes. And she was like, oh, yeah, I'm a Negro woman. Where am I going to get? And that was a term that they used in those days. So she ends up going before this judge, and Hidden Figures plays this out very beautifully. But I loved what she did because it was a practice for segregation to take place in the South for much longer than anyone had anticipated and way past the time the federal laws were passed. And he came right out and said to her when he saw her, he was in a sort of a shock. And anybody that hasn't seen Hidden Figures should definitely watch it. But he said to her, what would permit a colored woman to go to an all white high school? I know the federal law, but Virginia has its own law, and Virginia law still is the law. And she said, Your Honor, I believe there are special circumstances. And he said to her, What could possibly be? And she said, May I approach the bench? And I often say to people, you talk about a leadership conversation, there was so much at stake. There were all these white folks in the gallery. Her decision to approach the bench was to give him the privacy needed to make the decision she needed and to give her the opportunity to quietly have the conversation that needed to be had. In the chocolate conversation, I write about worldviews, standards, and concerns. The worldview in the South was that you were at a different ranking if you were of color. He grew up thinking that was perfectly normal to not take a seat on a bus, to not be able to go to a school, to be inferior. And so, if she had gone into the mouth of the beast and strictly dealt with trying to change that worldview, that judge wouldn't have budged. So, she took a completely different route and she went out of the technically correct sphere, as I call it, into what is the social sphere and decided, let me make a connection. So she said, Your Honor, you were first to graduate from George Mason College. You were first to be named a judge in by three consecutive judges. And she went on about all of his firsts. And she played to not only the chemistry between them, but his ego. And he sat back and he said, You've done your research. And what's the point? That's what he said to her. And she said, Neil Armstrong, Navy man from New Hampshire, will be the first man to go into space because he was also a Navy man. She connected those dots.
Yep.
And she said, and he will forever be remembered. She put that out there, right? Then she said, Your Honor, I can't change the color of my skin. I have no choice. I always choke up when I think about this. I have no choice but to be the first. And she said, Today, you will try all these cases. Which one will be remembered 100 years from now? Which one is going to make you the first? And I think about what it took to do that. And the fact that we get to stand here in a different time with freedoms we would not have had were it not for women like that. And of course, he turned around and he whispered, Only the night classes. And that's the only classes she could have taken, Nola, because she was working during the day at NASA and
Right.
she wanted to be a NASA engineer. And of course, she hops out of that courtroom. And I think to myself, leadership in the moment, choices, conversation. What a magnificent conversation that hits all of the tenets of what we're looking for. I don't think we realize the impact of that. I don't think we realize the impact of the conversation that Martin Luther King had when he spoke to the public, or the conversation that Winston Churchill had on the beach when he said, We will not surrender. We will not surrender. There are so many Gandhi when he says, First they fight you, first they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. It's just so much of what goes on in life when we look at the people that stand out among us. They are the people willing to have those conversations, those tough, and they're always story like. They carry a narrative.
That's what caught my attention in Gavin's newsletter. It's like he's got this picture of a citadel, and it's like story is how you get into the citadel of the mind.
It's so true. And Gavin used to follow me around when we first started, when I was doing my thing, and he would say to me, "You're a natural storyteller." And he is the consummate learner, probably one of the most learned persons I know. And he established that whole arc of storytelling, watching others tell stories. And he was not by nature a natural storyteller, but he became one. And it's now I said, I'm the student of the student. We have such a wonderful time together. And I'm approaching that time when I will be a chairman and there will be two CEOs, Gavin and this other gentleman, David, who's a young man, younger than Gavin and considerably younger than me. And we're building up the next generation of leaders that will be in Fast Forward Consulting Group. And my role right now is to take the years I've had, 52 years in business, and say, can I work sharing some wisdom and some support to men and women who are attempting to try to be leaders in a very noisy world? We don't have a lot to look to. We've got people on the public stage in public leadership positions that are failing the people they supposedly are serving. And it's a shame. There's vitriol everywhere you look. And I have a last chapter in this book called Civil Discourse, The Return of Civil Discourse. I miss it, Nola. My father was a World War II Marine, a
Right.
published poet, and he was conversant in a lot of the Romance languages. But we were lifelong Democrats, to be honest. But people used to come to the house that were conservative, and my father was fine with them having a point of view. Everybody talked and got energized. And it was like, but he used to say to me, if you have to scream and shut down a conversation, you can't hold up your side of the argument. And that's what, before he died, he was astounded by what was going on. And so we wanted to get the last administration out because of the vitriol. So we bring in the new one, and there's equal vitriol and none of the benefits. We end up with inflation and borders and all that. And people are like, what is different? What can we do that's different? And I think we leaders in business have to set the stage for how we're going to be different. It's not going to happen in government. I will say one thing very quickly. The gentleman that did the endorsement of this book, Ajay Banga, he was previously the CEO of MasterCard and then became chairman. He is now the US nominee to run the World Bank. And I am excited about it because he's Indian. He's extraordinary. He's the best CEO I ever worked with, other than Bill McDermott. And he has a vision that he brought into MasterCard, a world beyond cash, create financial inclusivity for people who did not have the same economic advantages around the world. So for him to get this post is so remarkable. And I'm so deeply thankful and very honored that he endorsed the book. And this is a man that's a consummate storyteller and a fabulous conversationalist, and he cares. So I'm thinking to myself, that's my dream and my hope for this book is that we can start a conversation among leaders in business, in private sector, and in public sector that will begin to change the conversation around the world.
No, very admirable goal. I did actually want to ask you about the book itself because my podcast used to be called the Janus Oasis. And I rebranded to be Hybrid Remote Center of Excellence just because it was more in line with what I was actually trying to achieve. But I'm very fond of that mythology and that image. And not to mention, one of your branding colors is a very close color. One of my branding colors is a very close color to the actual color of the book. So I wondered if you could talk about what that image meant to you, why you selected it, and how that helps you tell that story and start those conversations.
Yeah. So I really believe in every human being, there's the feminine and the masculine. I told you that earlier. So when I spoke to our studio as we were beginning to design the book, there were a couple things. I apologize for this. It's my phone going off, and I'm going to turn it off so we don't have to deal with this. So I said to them, I want the book to represent men and women, the yin and the yang. I liked the whole ancient Greek mythology because I really love ancient Greek mythology, because I believe there's a lot of truth in it. And these are ring downs that we live with today. And in a world that is, how shall I say, secular, where
Mhm.
there's not a lot of spirituality and there's not a lot of people that really see beyond what they see. That was one of the reasons I asked for them to pick an image that would codify that for me, that would be yin and yang, ancient, and all give, I guess, credence to the fact that leadership goes all the way back to the ancient times when which people had amazing minds. And I think of even in the Trojan War, and I think of all of the Spartans. And there's a wonderful book called Gates of Fire, which deals with that particular war. And they were stacked against them, but the king got off and started building the wall when everybody asked them what they needed to do, and he just did what he needed to do. So I wanted the book and the cover to kind of embrace all of that. The ancient, the sense of leadership being very much about wisdom more than it was about intellect, and it being the color that I love, which is that Tiffany blue, even though this isn't exactly Tiffany blue, it's close. And I wanted it to just have that appeal to understand that we're not just talking about modern day, we're talking of thousands and thousands of years of principles and wisdom and where all of that comes from. So tell me why you chose that image in the very beginning.
In a lot of ways, it's similar, but it was more about actually how, because I majored in history in addition to math, I actually wanted to tie together what's happened in the past, and then of course my podcast focuses on the future of work, right? And my title that I assume for my consulting work is hybrid remote futurist, right? Because I'm looking at what solutions we put in place right now, but they also have to be sustainable, because how often have we had the opportunity to redesign work, right? So whatever you're doing right now is going to have to be adjustable and adaptable for 5 or 10 years from now, or at least you've got to think that way, right? So how do you tie the best of the past into the future to set everybody up for success? That's really where that dual face, one looking towards the past, one looking towards the future, that's what captured my attention. But also Janus is actually associated with doors, right? So again, that theory of if you can't go through the front door with an argument, can you go through the window? Can you, is
That's
there a
interesting. I
beginning?
didn't know that. I didn't know that it was
Yeah.
associated with doors.
Yeah. So again, that comes
Tell me
back to
more
that
about that.
worldview, right?
Yeah, tell me more about that, about the
Um,
doors.
yeah. So for me, it's just if you're having a discussion and you're trying to get somebody on your side and illustrate those commonalities, it might not be the argument that you have to. It might be the argument of this is why what we have in common. Let's establish those familiarities. And then this is not like an actual door, but I'm going to make it into a door. It might be a window.
That's exactly what Terry Jackson did
Right.
when she spoke with the judge. Yeah.
Yes. So when I
Uh,
met Gavin last year, he was born in Keswick in the UK. I
yes.
lived in Keswick, Ontario.
Oh my
So
gosh.
that was how I approached him. And I'm like, I've never met anybody who actually lived. I spent my life talking about Keswick in the UK because I know it exists, but I've never met anybody who lived there.
Oh,
My
that's so
first point of
cool.
yeah. And then, of course, we both talk about story. And then when your book came up, it was the image that captured my attention. I'm like, oh, okay, I think that we have a lot in common. And then we were talking briefly before that. I mentioned that my main branding color is pink. And you started telling me that your auras, when you've had your aura,
Magenta, like a
yeah.
magenta pink. And I asked Agnese Barola Rizvi, who is an empath and does a lot of meditation work with people. I had brought her into Xerox at one point because she worked with a lot of corporate people. She's Italian from the Barola area of Tuscany. Her family was into the wine there. And she married a wonderful Indian man who was at the Harvard School, the Kenneth School, I think it was called, and he was doing a lot of work around leadership. So I ended up meeting her, and she was had a lot of influence on my life, and she would look at people's auras. And I didn't know anything about this. And she said to me, it depends. Certain people, you have a vibrancy and it shows in your aura. It's this wonderful, bright magenta color. And when you're not in a good place, I notice it gets very dull. I thought that's very interesting. And other people have soft blues and different, I didn't even realize all these different auras, but any rate, and then she explained to me that green, I think, was around the intellect, and then there's other healing kinds of colors, and there's a lot that's done in the area of color and different things. So I find all this very fascinating, and I don't look my nose down at anything because I do believe that today we live in a paint by numbers world, and I don't want to paint by numbers.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And honestly, there's other influences, like you mentioned that Gavin is like a learner beyond learner, right? I like to look at art, right? Have you heard of Amy Herman? Have you come across her?
I
She's
have.
amazing, right? So she
Yeah.
teaches leadership. She actually teaches, if you don't actually know, if you're listening, she actually was trained as a lawyer and she's also an art historian. And she combined those two careers to really advise like law enforcement and government about how to critically think differently using art as the medium.
And I gotta tell you, I do remember this and I loved it. One of my best friends is an art historian, a brilliant woman who doesn't realize how brilliant she is, which is
Mhm.
unfortunate. But I do believe that other mediums help. It's
Yes.
like I often use different other than business books, different genres and different ways in which I speak about things, like Hidden Figures, for example,
Yeah.
or The Gates of Fire. There was a series on that I'm praying will come back soon, Gilded Age, and it was written by the same guy, Julian Fellows, who had done Downton Abbey. And there's tremendous learning in these things. In Downton Abbey, for example, the lord of that particular dynasty is losing money. So his son in law figures out a way to help him, and he teams up with the other son-in-law, and this guy feels Lord Grantham like he's being sidelined. And so one day at breakfast, the second son-in-law, who's not in the lead position, says to him, "There's no question that first son-in-law is a bright, brilliant business mind, and I'm pretty good at understanding farming and whatever, but nobody knows people like you do." Or has the network that you have, or knows how to connect the way that you do. And I'm thinking the three of us could do a lot of great things together. And he looks at him in a very British way and he said, "You're quite elegant. You're quite eloquent." And you can see in that moment when, to your point, he finds a window or a door that opens up the conversation rather than shutting it down.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, Lord Grantham doesn't feel sidelined anymore. He has real value. I have often told leaders on teams there are people that are natural connectors on your team. They may not be the highest performers, they may not have the best technical expertise, but they're natural brokers and bridges. They bring people together, they connect. They're as valuable to you as the people that are the top performers. And obviously you have to perform, Nola. I'm not suggesting that someone that's not performing stay on the team, but not to look at everybody through the same lens and to realize everybody brings different things to what we call a team. Most recently in this Gilded Age, if you get a chance to watch it, it's worthwhile. It deals with that time in America when there was tremendous stack ranking and who was in and who was out, and Lena Astor's 400 and all this stuff. And there's a very wealthy young man whose father does not wants him to be in his business. And Stanford White builds their house, the great architect, and he works with Stanford White, the young boy, and he comes back to his dad, graduated from Harvard. "I want to be an architect." Father says, "Are you kidding? You're going to run my business. You're not being an architect." So there's this wonderful conversation in the moment. It's another one of those hidden figure ones where he says to his dad, "Don't you understand you're a genius? There's probably only 40 people in the country that could even be anything like you, 40 men in the country. I would always be the disappointing son, the shadow of the great man that you are." He does it in such a way, Nola, that the guy looks at him, his father, and he goes, "You're very kind." And the boy says, "But if I take my own path, I have a shot at being my own man and doing something great and not being the disappointing second act." And the father looks at him and he says, "You've given me a lot to think about." And he says, what will I do with my company? He says, you will train men like you, good men like you, that love it as much as you do, and they will make a future for my sister and me. And the father looks at him and he says, I'll consider it. And he walks away. And again, you don't get that in a business book. Julian Fellows is brilliant. He wrote Downton Abbey. He's writing this. It's supposed to come
Yeah.
back. But when you watch these things and you see the interaction, it gives you knowledge and a sense of that that young boy had enough wisdom to know that if he told his father the truth, but he cloaked it in a way, to your point, where he found that window or another door where there was none, he could open the conversation rather than getting it shut down. Because
Yeah.
when he went direct the first time, boom.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to run into a wall of resistance. And it's more about like, how do you influence the story that the person tells themselves? Because that's what changes minds. That's what changes
Right.
hearts, is you have to actually consider how they talk to themselves. And so he's appealing to him as a father in addition to a business person. And it's just important to him. He probably knows that it's just important to him to be a good father as it is to be a successful business person.
Exactly. Beautifully
Right?
said. And
Yeah.
not everything can happen. I look at Putin and I say, what conversation could you have with someone like this? What would change this conversation? He's clearly in way beyond what he anticipated. I've got to believe in my mind, Nola, that he sits back and what did I get myself into? But he's so maniacal that he can't get past the fact that he has to keep going and keep winning.
I think the part of the problem, and again, I'm not an expert by any means, but every visual of him, he's always very distant from everyone. There's one
Totally.
photo where he's sitting at one end of his giant
I
table.
saw that.
And to me, he's keeping everybody at arm's length because he knows that if he lets anybody close to him, for one, he's not sure if he can trust them, but if he lets people close to him, they have a chance of actually influencing the story that he tells himself. And so I
Very
think
well said.
he's keeping people at a distance on purpose, and he
And
doesn't
it's an
know how.
exposure. He doesn't want to be exposed. I think you're right. I
Yeah,
think you're right. And he's impervious to any of the feedback that whatever he is getting, he's not. It's very sad. I'm
yeah,
looking at it and saying, oh my God, what happens in these situations? It's really very frightening.
yeah, it definitely is. Of
Let me ask you a question. Is your
course,
hair gray?
it is white. So I have
It's
something called
magnificent.
Wardenburg syndrome. So it's a hereditary genetic disorder, I guess you could call it. It's a syndrome. So my eyes are actually different colors. I'm not sure if you can see it. This one's blue. This one's greenish.
Because they look identical.
Yeah,
Yeah, from
it's
here.
hard in this environment, but my hair started turning white when I was 7. And my daughter was actually born with a white streak. So I was born just like this section of my hair was white. And then it gradually got more. And I've been pretty much totally white since my mid 30s
It's
after I had
gorgeous.
kids. Thank
It's
you.
absolutely gorgeous. I looked at it and I said to myself, it is gorgeous because it doesn't look gray. It looks almost like it's been kissed by the sun.
Yeah,
It's just beautiful and it's pure white.
it is pure white. Yeah,
I
exactly.
love it. I love it.
And I'm actually in a kid's book. There's an author that I know. Again, I met her on LinkedIn, Kristen Sherry. She's actually Canadian, but she lives in, I think, North Carolina now. And she wrote this book about bullying. It's basically an anti-bullying book. And what she did was she collected stories of real life people. And so, like when I was a kid, like kids would call me grandma, right?
You're
And
kidding.
oh yeah, yeah. I've never been carded in my life except when I went to go see Basic Instinct. Everybody's always thought that I'm older than I
That
am.
was some movie, wasn't it?
That
Oh
was
my
some movie, but
God.
I'm like, it's
Oh,
funny because I bought the ticket. I was in the theater, and I think it was because it was completely dark. I was wearing just track pants and whatnot, but I had my hair up. And I think because he couldn't see the color of my hair, that's why he questioned my age. That's the only time anybody's ever questioned my age. When I went on a cruise with Holland America, I really fit in. It was like the first time I've actually really been in like a cruise with a bunch of seniors that I really fit in with. What gave me away were my knees, right?
is your daughter all white now?
She's not. No, she still has a streak. She's a little bit of her eyebrow is a little bit white, but gradually I expect that to go the same way as well. But it's interesting to me, and that's honestly why I have the insight I do. A lot of times it's like people make up these stories
Oh,
about
they do. Oh,
who
they
I
do.
should be. I gave birth to my daughter, I was 32, and this man at the grocery store, I was literally 6 weeks postpartum, and he asked me if she was my first grandchild, right? So people have never been able to see me. It's more always about the story that they tell themselves about who I should be. And that's where it's fascinating to me. And
But you
that's
have
actually,
magnificent skin and no
oh, thanks.
wrinkles. Yeah, it's stupid. I what I saw was somebody very ethereal. And is your daughter getting any kind of pushback?
It's different for her. You know why? Because of Harry Potter and Frozen, because
How wonderful.
stories that didn't exist when I was a kid that help her tell that story. Now, she doesn't adore those stories anymore, but like she actually has a little line, like a white spot. Like you can actually see it on my arm. We
Oh,
have
yes.
pigmentation
Yes.
differences on our skin as well too. And I'm deaf in one ear. That's all part of it as well. And she has that too. But like Harry Potter has that scar right on his forehead. And Frozen, when she's touched by the magic, the what is it, Anna, has this
Yes.
streak of white. So that's what her generation has associated that with.
How
And that's a
wonderful is
positive
that?
thing. Yeah,
I think that's great.
yeah,
And
it
kids
is.
today seem to be more tolerant of a lot of things, I've noticed. There's still bullying, but my son never knew whether you were this or you were that or you were the other thing. And I remember we went out to play. He was very little, and there was a very blonde, blue-eyed boy who was being very difficult. And he came over to me, and he had a little Jamaican nanny who was terrific. We're friends to this day. Pat, my son's 38 now. And he said, that white kid is just being, I said, does Zach think and Zach was blonde and blue-eyed. So I'm like, does he think he's not white? This is very interesting. So I walked over to him and I go, honey, I said, do you know that you're also white? He said to me, yeah, but he's real white. And I cracked up and I thought in more ways than one, he got it. Had always all these friends, Indian and Hispanic and people of color. And we have a rainbow kind of family. And I thought to myself, it's interesting what it was like in my day back and to you, what you went through and the prejudices that people have that you don't even realize where they're coming from.
Yeah.
But the fact that you wear it long too is very attractive.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that honestly started in the pandemic, and then it's like, okay. My husband has been for years bugging me to wear it long, and now
I
it's
love it.
long, and he
I
doesn't want
love
me to
it.
cut it.
Let me see. Can you stand up so I can
Oh,
see it?
sure. Yeah,
Oh, it's beautiful.
yeah. So I don't know if you
Yes,
can
it's
see the
very
whole thing
beautiful. She's very beautiful, isn't she,
there.
Shannon? Oh
She's
my
gorgeous.
God.
Yeah.
She's very beautiful.
Yeah.
But it's hilarious. And her daughter now has not had to go through this because her daughter has a little scar here that's white and a streak. But because of Frozen and Harry Potter, she's the most popular kid of her
It's
age group all think she's cool.
it's the
That's
frame of
such a
reference, right?
it's such a great story. It is the worldview. It's
Yeah.
the frame of reference. You asked me, and in conclusion, I know we're coming up on the hour. What prompted the chocolate conversation came out of I was a senior in Boston University
Mm.
last year, and I got invited to a BYOC, bring your own chocolate party. And I was so happy because quite frankly, Nola, the booze thing never worked for me. Stand around and hold the thing. But I got there and I thought I'm going to be the hit of this party. I brought my killer chocolate cake. Everyone's going to love chocolate. We're going to eat chocolate. How great could this be? That table was laden with confections, the likes of which I paled in comparison. But we were walking, a guy and I that met there, we were walking, and this girl who was so trim, remember thinking to myself, how could she possibly eat anything? Look at this woman, the kind you love to hate. She's starting to talk about percentage of Keiko and getting all wound up. And this young man is standing next to me and he says, when I want chocolate, a Snickers bar will do just fine.
Yeah.
And she goes, oh, she was insulted and walked away. So years later, I was in an all company meeting at Xerox and they were putting out a very complex strategy. And everyone left there with a different interpretation. And I thought to myself, he said that we are now going to move from being the copier company to the document company. And nobody understood what that meant. And so everybody went back, and he was very annoyed. The CEO called us all back in. And I said, we're having a chocolate conversation. At the worldview level, everybody got the fact that we couldn't be a copier company anymore because copies were no longer the thing. But what did it mean that you were going to have new documents printed on demand and this new strategy, and it was going to be digital? And we had different standards for how the implementation of that would take place. And the concern was, how do we go from having online printing to printing in digital, in the cloud, and all these other things? It was the beginning of what I realized why we always have these chocolate conversations. Then I thought successfully, Stephen Jobs, after many failures, made a decision to start with the concern rather than the world. And when you try to push your worldview on somebody, to your point, your own frame of reference, you create an environment for an argument.
Yeah.
When you start with people's concerns, and he knew the world was in tough shape, people needed entertainment, they needed an escape, and he came up with the iPod. Did you stay up night thinking that you needed 1,000 songs in your pocket?
No.
I didn't. But with that, he was able to set a new standard for the industry and change the worldview around how music was consumed. Sony should have come up with that innovation, but he did with the iPod. And it led me to understand that if you want to unpack a chocolate conversation, go to the concern. What's
Yeah.
the concern right now in the world? The economy, safety, psychological and physical safety, the ability to travel, health, huge.
Yeah.
People are getting these viruses everywhere they go, different viruses. So these are all the concerns people have. Inflation, they're very frightened of. Are we going to the failure of the banks? So you go after the concern first. Then you figure out what's the standard for how we're going to change that, and how do we reframe people's worldviews,
Yeah.
whether we liked it or not. Trump being a terrible example of a human being, but an incredible ability to do that.
Yeah. This is true.
Isn't
Uh,
that interesting? Yeah.
that is the conversation that I think that is the hardest right now, and that's where it directly relates to my work, is the return to office and the
Yes.
mandates, because you've got senior executives who
Yes.
aren't necessarily hearing the frontline concerns, or it's like a game of telephone throughout the company where, those concerns are being conveyed, but by the time it actually floats up to the leadership level who are making those decisions about whether you come back to the office or not, they're not hearing, so that the conversation is not tracking. There's no flow of
No.
information both ways.
And it's a major chocolate conversation. I was recently at JP Morgan. They used to have resumes that they turned down the top of the top.
Right.
And unfortunately now they're not getting that same demand. And everybody's dancing around the elephant in the room, Nola. No one will admit that the reason is there's not a hybrid work model that we can come to. Everybody's been asked to return to office. And so these young people, they don't want the job if the job is 100% traveling into the city and going to a building.
Yep.
My niece turned down a very high paying job with one of the very top tech companies for the same reason. She
Yep.
said, I'd rather stay where I am to have a work balance. That pandemic opened up for people the opportunity to have their cake and eat it too, to
Yep.
have an opportunity to be with your family. And nobody has a problem going into work occasionally. It's nice to go to the office on occasion,
Yeah, it's
but
nice to
to
have a choice.
but to be told that you have to be there and you're doing good work, because that is something that a lot of the companies, the financial industry in particular, they're fighting it tooth and nail. They're saying that it ruins the culture. Culture does not happen in a building.
No.
Culture happens with people. We have remote, and we have people can come in. And on Mondays, we do what's on your plate, all virtually. On Fridays, what's on your mind. 1 hour, tails, and everybody loves it. And so if people can get in, terrific. And if they can't, we don't hassle with it. It's here for you when you want to come in and have a reason to come in, but we're
Yeah.
not forcing it.
Exactly. And a lot of that is really related to worldviews, because the leaders, that's how they've always been successful, is in person. That's how they understand that people learn. That's how they trained themselves. That's how they trained their people. And they have yet to flip that worldview. And the challenge is, how do you do that? How do you get in front of them, and what influences them to make that change?
And
So,
I think it's going to be the drive for talent because they're not going to
I
get
agree.
top talent. And
Yep.
I think it's also going to be the performance. Right now, we've got, unfortunately, failures with banks and a lot of things are going on. It's a crazy world we're living in, and we have to find our footing. And people don't feel safe going into cities either. It's very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that have to be considered with this. Any rate, we're at the
We,
hour. It was
we
been
are.
such a pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation
I did
very much.
too. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And it's so nice to meet you. And you and Gavin do great work, and you seem to be
Thank
wonderful
you.
partners together. So,
Thank you. Thank you very much.
well,
Okay, my
definitely.
darling.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye, Rose.
Bye.